Well, last week, after our service, we got into a discussion about whether everything written in the Bible is true. And as lovers of truth, that can sometimes be a very difficult topic for us to approach with brutal honesty. Now, I was raised being taught that I should question everything, but that meant everything except the Bible, for the Bible was the standard that I was to use for that questioning. To question the Bible was to question God, and we are all too often taught that doubting God is sin and can lead us to lose the faith and spend eternity being burned alive in hell. But if you're anything like me, you love the truth, and you can't abide believing anything that is not actually true. Now, you might have noticed the changes we made to the decorations on the wall behind the stage and the sign out front and the group logo. In the background of the sign are icons for the world's most popular religions. And in the very center is an icon which you might recognize as representing religious non-belief or atheism, to symbolize that we don't necessarily believe the various world religions without careful examination of each of their claims and holding those claims up to skeptical evaluation and the light of evidence. Behind me, and in the group logo, the cross and the Star of David represent religious beliefs, and the symbol in the middle represents the absence of any religious belief at all. Today's message will hopefully explain the reason for that emblem and why, even in a religious context, the absence of belief must be the default position, the place from which we start if we hope to discover what is actually true. To presuppose is to suppose or assume beforehand. It is to take something for granted in advance before thorough investigation. When we start with a presupposition, we begin with the assumed answer already in place. And the reason this blocks the discovery of truth is because it skews our minds toward a predefined interpretation of the evidence. For example, if someone presupposes a conspiracy is in place, then the evidence will seem to them to support the claims that the moon landing was a hoax, 911 was a government plot, and NASA was created to hide the fact that the Earth is actually flat. Similarly, if we examine any religious text with the belief that it is the infallible word of a god or gods who cannot lie, then instead of comparing its contents to observable reality, we will compare observable reality to what it says. And if it says something that is not true, instead of recognizing the flaw, we will reject what actually is true. Does that make sense? Let's take a quick look at the idea that the Earth is a flat disk covered by a dome over which there is water. Now, this was a popular myth in ancient times before we had sufficient evidence to prove otherwise. From everything people could see, it appeared as though the Earth was a flat disk. The sun revolved around the face of the Earth, and the moon, roughly the same size as the sun, gave off its own light. They could have said, "It looks like that's the case, but since we don't have the means to properly examine reality, we'll just accept that we don't know." But instead, they made up answers to their unanswered questions. And when speaking about things that relate to this topic, the writers of the texts in the Bible included those myths as statements of fact. Genesis chapter 1, verses 6 through 8 and 14 through 18 says, "Then God said, 'Let there be a firmament in the midst of the waters, and let it divide the waters from the waters.' Thus God made the firmament and divided the waters which were under the firmament from the waters which were above the firmament, and it was so. God called the firmament heaven, so the evening and morning were the second day. Verse 14. Then God said, Let there be lights in the firmament of the heavens to divide the day from the night, and let them be for signs and seasons and for days and years, and let them be for lights in the firmament of the heavens to give light on the earth. And it was so. Then God made two great lights, the greater light to rule the day and the lesser light to rule the night. He made the stars also. God set them in the firmament of the heavens to give light on the earth, and to rule over the day and over the night, and to divide the light from the darkness. And God saw that it was good. So this is pretty clear that the firmament is the space between the water on earth and the water above the sky. And it was in that firmament that God placed the sun and moon and stars, which is what most flat earthers believe today. Well, they are simply agreeing with what the Bible says. Genesis 7:11. In the 600th year of Noah's life, in the second month, the 17th day of the month, on that day, all the fountains of the great deep were broken up, and the windows of heaven were opened. Genesis 8:2. The fountains of the deep and the windows of heaven were also stopped, and the rain from heaven was restrained. So that dome that keeps the waters above the heaven from falling back to earth has windows which are open to allow some of that water to fall in the form of rain. Job 37:18. Hast thou with him spread out the sky, which is strong and as a molten looking glass? That is the dome. It reflects back the light from the sun while also allowing us to see the blue waters above it. Psalm 148:4. Praise him, you heavens of earth, and you waters above the heavens. That's just another reference to the blue water above the dome. Matthew 4:8. Again, the devil took him to a very high mountain and showed him all the kingdoms of the world and their splendor. If one believes the earth is flat, he or she would also expect that if you only go up high enough, you could see the whole earth. Isaiah 40:22. He sits enthroned above the circle of the earth, and its people are like grasshoppers. He stretches out the heavens like a canopy and spreads them out like a tent to live in. Now, this could just be poetic, but it sounds an awful lot like it's saying the earth is a disk, which is the meaning of the word translated here as circle, which is a different word than sphere. It also sounds as though there is, once again, a dome above the heavens. So these verses reflect the primitive belief that the earth is a flat disk covered by a dome. Above the dome is water, which is why the sky is blue. And when God opens the windows of heaven, some of that water is allowed to fall back down to earth. And again, they also make the claim that if you go to a high enough altitude, you can see the whole earth. Apologists use a number of approaches to explain these away, but the false claims are in there nonetheless. Thankfully, we don't believe the Bible's claims that the earth is flat or that it is covered by a dome covered by water. Well, maybe we don't, but some do. Maybe some of you here or listening believe the earth is flat. Not only do the verses we just read support that belief, but they are only a few of the Bible passages referenced on flatearthdoctrine.com. That site also lists dozens of Bible quotations that say the sun moves, for example, while the earth stands still. The sun stopped moving in Isaiah 60, Job 9, Joshua 10, and Habakkuk 3:11. The sun moved backwards in 2 Kings 20. The moon produces its own light in Genesis 1, Isaiah chapters 13, 30, and 60, Jeremiah 31, Ezekiel 32, Matthew 24, and Revelation 21. The whole earth can be seen from a high enough altitude in Daniel 4 and Matthew 4. Hell is a bottomless pit at the heart of the flat earth in Revelation chapters 9, 11, 17, and 20. And if you don't believe the earth is a large snow globe, chances are pretty good you do believe other things the ancient writers claimed that have been proven to be factually wrong, such as the age of the earth and the story of a 6-day creation. Now, you may be familiar with Ray Comfort, a very popular Christian apologist. He said, "Look for a mistake in the Word of God, and you will make one." Now, of course, that presupposes that everything men chose to include in the collection of writings called the Bible are actually the Word of God. But if they are, then God was as ignorant as the ones who claimed to speak for him. Of course, we have to keep in mind that Ray Comfort is also famous for pointing to how perfectly the banana fits inside the human hand because God designed it for us. But the truth is that the banana we know today is the result of many years of cultivation by man. The wild banana is barely edible, and it is not shaped at all like the ones we recognize today. In Matthew 13, Jesus claims that the mustard seed is the smallest of all seeds. But this is actually false. We now know that there are other seeds that are smaller. Deuteronomy 20 claims that the Canaanites were totally annihilated. But this is false. Recently analyzed DNA evidence shows that the Canaanites left many descendants. Proverbs 6 through 8 is a popular passage that says, "Go to the ant, you sluggard, consider its ways and be wise. It has no commander, no overseer or ruler, yet it stores its provisions in summer and gathers its food at harvest." This is actually false. We now know from observation that ants live in a colony with many subdivisions, and those subdivisions include workers, supervisors, and queens. So ants do have overseers and rulers. Other Bible passages tell us that many of the stars will, in the last day, fall to the earth. If they are tiny lights inside the dome, that makes sense. But in reality, the sun is a star, and not a very big one at that. And if just that one small star somehow started moving toward the earth, this planet would be destroyed. From counting years back through biblical genealogies, Earth as we know it today appears to have been created, along with all life, only a few thousand years ago. Yet we know from the fields of astronomy, physics, chemistry, biology, geology, linguistics, paleontology, and archaeology that this is not the case. And this is a major sticking point for many Christians. A number of Christian organizations have been formed with the sole purpose of proving the biblical creation account is true, and their full-time employees spend countless hours trying to come up with such proof. Now, I've quoted some of them in past sermons, only to later discover that what I quoted was actually wrong. Most, if not all of us here and listening, have probably seen our fair share of memes asking where the transitional fossils are, and we've seen and perhaps repeated the claims that there are none. But in reality, there are actually thousands we've discovered so far, and it's almost certain we've only scratched the surface. We've probably all heard the argument that evolution is only a theory. But a scientific theory is not the same as a colloquial theory. Rather, a scientific theory is about as close to an absolute fact as a scientific method allows. It's on the same level as germ theory or the theory of gravity. And yet, if we accept that everything was created basically as it is today only a few thousand years ago, we have to reject the mountains of evidence to the contrary. And that goes back to the point I made at the beginning. A lack of belief is the place we must begin in our pursuit of truth, if we can ever hope to reliably find it. Because of this, our belief in any claim should be suspended until we have sufficient and sufficiently good evidence to prove that claim to be true. The warning from many of the writings included in the Bible is that we must not question, we must not doubt, and we must not test the claims, but we must instead accept them as absolute truth, despite any evidence to the contrary. But let me ask you, would we accept that approach to any other claim? For everything else in our lives, we would consider such a demand to be intolerable, and we would probably be incredibly suspicious of those making the claims. For those trying to sell us something, we would probably walk away, or if they're at our home, we would probably ask them to leave. For those making non-Christian religious claims, we would probably consider them to be cult leaders. If someone handed you a copy of ancient Sumerian religious texts, and they said that it was the direct words of their gods, and you must believe every word, because if you don't, you will be tormented in the afterlife for all eternity, would you believe them? Probably not. At least I hope you wouldn't. But why wouldn't you? Is it because you demand extraordinary evidence before believing extraordinary claims? Or is it because you've already accepted the unproven claims made by other religious texts? Perhaps the Quran, or the Book of Mormon, or the Sutras, or the Bible? No, I'm not saying they aren't true, but is believing something until it's proven false a good approach? Or might it be more prudent to withhold belief until a fantastic claim is proven to actually be true? Now, I don't know about you, but I personally want to believe as few false things as possible. And the most reliable way to achieve that is to withhold belief in any claim until there is sufficient evidence to warrant belief. Now, for some things, it doesn't matter. If I told you that I have a birthmark on my ankle, would you tell me you refuse to believe until I prove it? Probably not. After all, many people have birthmarks, so there's a reasonable chance that I have one as well. And it's an insignificant claim. It won't affect your life one way or the other if it turns out that my ankles are both birthmark-free. Besides, if it was true, I could provide proof. But what if I told you that I am from a planet in a distant galaxy, and I've traveled here to help you transcend your physical form so that you can rise above this lowly plane and journey with me to my distant paradise home? Do you think that just maybe more people would leave and never talk to me again than might do the same just because I'm promoting an objective examination of the claims made in the Bible? Now, I realize there are dozens of cognitive biases, which you could call faulty programs in the human mind, and they're bound to be going off right now. One of them is called the Backfire Effect, and it is defined as the reaction to disconfirming evidence by strengthening one's previous beliefs. In other words, it's a flaw in the human mind that when we hear evidence against something we believe, we hold on to that belief even more firmly than before. So while evidence to the contrary should cause us to become less confident in a belief, our mental programs glitch out and we believe the faulty conclusion even more strongly. But I hope that realizing this fact will help you overcome it yourself, and that you will have a reasonable reaction instead. And if you discover that I believe something that is not evidently true, I hope you will challenge that belief. And if I believe something that you also believe, and you cannot find sufficient and sufficiently good evidence that it's true, I hope that you will challenge both of us. Well, I hope this has given us just some food for thought, and that it provides a healthy challenge to some of our presuppositional beliefs. And I'd like for us to take just a few minutes to take a deep breath, shake off any false feelings that we've just been attacked, and let any truth that might have been spoken today sink in. Whenever you need to go, you're dismissed, and as always,